welcome to the listeners of Cross Border Talks, who are now to listen to an interesting discussion with Catherine Andre, who is co-founder and leading editor of France-based cross-border media, which is called voxEurop. voxEurop has recently republished some articles from Cross Border Talks, and it was interesting to engage voxEurop for a number of reasons, mainly that both Cross Border Talks and voxEurop try to be cross-border in the European Union, and there is certain tendency of cross-border media or cross-border journalism to grow. It is also a tendency related to the discussions about the need for European public space, basically a space where various citizens of different languages or cultures are able to be aware of what happens in their region or in the whole of the EU. So we have to discuss about different things. And first of all, I would like to start to ask Mrs. Andre about her media. What is the story of your media? How did your team decide to found it? And how would you describe its mission and achievements so far?
Hello, Vladimir. Thanks a lot for giving me this opportunity to present voxEurop and talk about our mission and all the achievements we've managed so far and all the projects we have. So the story, if we start with the story, it really started at Courrier International. I don't know whether your readers are familiar with Courrier International, but maybe this is a French weekly magazine based in Paris, where the journalists read the press from all over the world in all the languages and make a selection of the best articles every week and reprint them into French, making a real newspaper. And within Courrier International, there was a website in 12 languages at the time called Press Europe. And Press Europe had been really an answer to a call, a tender from the European Commission. And after 5 years, there was a non renewal of the subsidy, and Press Europe had to be closed. So for a year, it kind of had almost disappeared. And some of my colleagues at Courrier International went on with trying to keep it going and publishing articles. So it's really a story of some journalists who had worked together at Courrier International. I myself didn't work for Press Europe. I was the deputy editor in chief of Courrier International in later years, in charge of Europe. So we had worked quite a lot together. And a year after the end of voxEurop, we decided to relaunch a new website, taking some of the archives and some of the know-how, especially the capacity of translating in many, many languages. And we co-founded together, four people actually, voxEurop, which was first an association, but in 2017 we decided to give it a cooperative form. So we are the first press cooperative in Europe, which is an interesting model, very resilient as we've seen so far, with a number of values that we all share and decided to share, the mission we gave ourselves is quite different from the ancestor Press Europe, which was more geared towards the institution, the European institutions. We are really trying to inform European citizens across Europe on the main challenges of our time, challenges that do cross borders and concern all Europeans. All over Europe. So we publish at the moment mainly in 5 languages rather than 10, hoping at some stage that we'll be able to publish in another 5 languages. So we do publish in English, French, German, Italian, and Spanish. All articles are being translated in those languages. And in the future, would love to be able to publish in Romanian, Polish, Czech, Portuguese, and Dutch. That would be our aim. At the moment, we concentrate on the five languages I just mentioned. And we decided to focus on four main themes, four main challenges that all Europeans are concerned with and are trying to find solutions for. The first one is climate change. The second one is politics and democracy. The third one is migration and asylum. The fourth one is social issues and the questions of inequalities. And of course, since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we are also focusing a lot on Ukraine and on the regional consequences of the war and the consequences for all European countries, actually. So we do publish very regularly also on Ukraine. So this is basically the story of Vox Europe. As far as the achievements are concerned, I think we are really aiming, that's our vocation really, to try to contribute to the creation of a European public sphere. And by circulating articles and translating them, we enable all citizens to have the same information, varied kind of information, of course, because they are being published from in different languages and by different journalists across Europe. And we also syndicate a lot of articles. So we select some articles being published by partners across Europe, and we publish them and translate them in the other four languages. So we are thinking that we are contributing today to this new kind of cross-border journalism. We're not the only ones, of course, to do it, but we do participate in a number of collaborative journalism or different projects putting together different medias across Europe, working together on European information.
Thank you for this presentation. And it's very good that you mentioned that you also collaborate or encourage the further spread of this tendency of cross-border journalism in the European Union, because Vox Europe will be one of the coordinators on the activity of the project PAUS, which aims to form a large transnational newsroom of media from Lithuania, Czechia, Austria, Greece, Spain, Poland, Romania, and Bulgaria. And you mentioned that Vox Europe wants to publish in more languages, so this project Pulse would allow publication of media content between different partners in 12 European languages. Um, Given that Vox Europe is part of that, I would like to ask you once again something about, maybe a little bit more about the concept of this cross-border journalism or pan-European public space. Why should European citizens be able to access content without language barriers? What advantages would this access give them? And to what extent cross-border media or projects as PAUS could lead to the creation of a pan-European public space?
Yes, thank you for the question. Yet again, it's really, we do believe that these translations enable to all Europeans to have access to the same kind of information, and especially information crossing borders. So it's both translations in many different languages, and it's also information that is not only focusing on national interest or national specific questions. It does happen, of course, but it's also to show that we are all dependent on each other's in Europe. And this kind of project, I think, really play a major role in democracy. That's what we believe already at Vox Europe, and we believe, of course, in that kind of of project also for Pulse, and also different other different projects I will mention later probably. So this is really Pulse is really a collaborative desk. So it's basically a project that enabled us to produce articles in, of course, a collaborative way throughout Europe with 13 different media, as you just mentioned, and we already are actually translating in all these languages and more in 27 languages really, and more even languages that are not specifically the AU languages. But we don't publish. We don't have the means at the moment to publish in all these languages. So of course, through Pulse, we first of all, as Voxio, um, we will be in charge of the translations in all these different languages, and of course, that will be published on the platform. So that's already one step further. As far as the European public sphere is concerned, is like voxEurop and other collaborative projects. I think we do believe this can play a very large and important role in the circulation of a varied kind of information coming from all the different countries and the different regions as well.
Okay, when we speak about having a common pan-European public space, we should maybe take into consideration that the western part of the EU and the eastern part have had different historical experience, um, even though they are now in the same European Union with laws that or other things that are common. There are different experiences and maybe different narratives generally between these regions. For example, we see that eastern member states such as Romania and Bulgaria tend to be associated with corruption or maybe conservative attitudes to an extent towards reform and things like that. On the other hand, um, uh, we also have, let's call them in inverted commas, Eastern narratives, which are maybe opposed to um, European Commission, green transition, LGBT rights, etc., or even on Ukraine, maybe there might be some differences. So I want to ask something about polarization because I guess really when uh, a pan-European public space maybe also have to deal with the issue of polarization between different countries in within societies and regions. So how should cross-border media deal with polarization, be it at the level of societies, regions, or the whole of the EU? Um, when we bear in mind that cross-border, by I guess by definition, means that it is not only on one place. This media is not only focused on one context in which from which it writes or reflects on the world.
Yeah, yes, exactly. You actually you just said it, and I do believe that in a way, not only focusing on national polarization, because there is, of course, some polarization, as you just mentioned, between maybe the Eastern European countries and the Western European countries. But I think it's more political, actually, polarization. And the rise, for example, of the extreme right wing parties goes, of course, far beyond, Eastern European countries. You have them all over Europe at the moment. In the wake of the European elections, I think we talk more and more about it, and it's all over the place. So I don't really believe, as far as I can see, as a journalist, even though I'm based in the Western European countries, I think more broadly, and I read the press from all over Europe, really. And I do believe that kind of cross border journalism helps us to go beyond that type of East and Western. I don't mean they don't exist because the history is different, but I think the polarization is really a tendency of our time throughout Europe, in every country, almost in every country, even in countries where you would have thought, like Portugal, for example, that maybe the extreme right wing parties would be kept at bay, and it's not the case anymore. So, in fact, by focusing maybe on a larger view on political parties that are trying to foster democracy, defend the freedom of the press, for example, or defend the general freedom, or are maybe more thinking of the migrants' conditions. They can be also kind of understanding that these kind of openness does exist in most European countries. It's not because in Hungary you have a government that is, of course, against a number of subjects raised regularly by the European Commission, as you just mentioned. It doesn't mean the whole country believes in it, of course. And I think Poland is a very, very good example. We thought that probably we had kind of lost Poland, and with the election of Donald Tusk, we see that history is going again in another direction. And I think having a broader view of what's happening in all European countries, and also a finer view of the different political parties that do exist, we help having a better understanding, and maybe a um, less division as we used to have between a so-called Eastern European narrative and a Western one.
Okay, you know that throughout Europe there is a rising issue with need to protect journalists from the so-called SLAPP cases. So recently, the EU has adopted a directive that is aimed at such protection, and it is now undergoing the process of transposition in the national legislation of the EU member states. I would have two questions on that to you. First of all, to what extent do you think that the efforts in direction of protection of journalists in the EU from big uh, court claims on them or their media are sufficient at this moment? And secondly, what should be done, further done, so that the influence of big money on the press and society is not that much hegemonic?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting deal that has been reached by the MEPs, this anti-SLAPP, especially especially because it applies also in cross-border cases, and that's quite interesting. And it's a way to try to protect more the journalistic freedom and the media outlets' freedom. It's probably not enough, but it's we have a big issue in Europe at the moment with the freedom of information and the security of journalists. As we know, the number of cases of journalists being killed in a number of countries has raised quite dramatically, and the protection of people and organizations active in all the areas actually of fundamental rights, and of course also in the sphere of the environment. It's another sphere where there's been a rising number of cases against the freedom of information or freedom, yeah, of the journalists working on these very sensitive issues. So basically, this is a step, I think, in the right direction, the fight against disinformation, and also to state that corruption. Investigations on corruption have to have a place, and there are a lot of intimidation and harassment against journalists. So I don't know whether you need more detail, but that would be my answer.
Um, uh, I also have this issue. I'm generally interested how big money can be limited in their influence, because we in capitalist societies we wake up with a reality in which maybe some financial companies or even individuals, or if you wish, juridical structures have really enormous resources. um, and just to give one example, for example, in Bulgaria, there are parties who are known or have been parties in the recent elections who are known to be sponsored by just one person, and they are just close to entering in the parliament. Their result was such that they were about to enter parliament, and it was not because, in my view at least, not because really these parties had some great contribution to social issues and their solution, but because the people or the person who was supporting these parties was very influential financially. So I'm generally I will, this is maybe the question I wanted to ask. How could big money have less or limited influence on press, given that we live in a market economy and capitalist societies?
I would answer that, of course, the probably the best solution is to have more independent media. Of course, medias are economically quite fragile when they're independent, and it's a real fight quite often to survive and not maybe to depend only on subsidies. But the independence of the press is one of the keys. Because in some countries, even public media, of course, if you have yeah, after an election, you have a new government, and that the government that we had in Poland, for example, for many years, they had, of course, taken control over the public media. So it's not only a question of public and private media; it's a question of independence of the press and have all the mechanism to protect the media and the work of the journalist. So independence is probably the key, and there could be mechanism to help independent media to keep to keep to be actually um, sufficient and enough in a country to not only depend on one big public media, for example, or one private media, because it's the same with private media. The relationship between financial capitalism and democracy, it's always been a problem. And of course, the more financial capitalism is taking over, the more sensitive these issues of freedom of information are going to be. So there's no easy answer, easy solution to prevent it. But of course, the work of the judges in some cases is very important, and probably then I think the EU could play a bigger role in this protection and naming the lack of freedom and naming the risk and trying to prevent the a concentration of, uh, of media that can be in the end detrimental to the quality of the information across the EU.
Okay, thank you for that. Basically, you see the European Union as a place where there is still hope in this regard, or there is still ability to do something about it. I want to ask you in this sense about the non-EU countries. We have seen that in the last decade or more, there has been generally a decline in freedom of speech in a number of non-EU countries for a number of reasons, but basically maybe the geopolitical contestation between West and periphery, let's say, in the world has been strengthened. There has been maybe deep states in these societies which or vested interests which put limits to free speech, and free speech is seen maybe as some tool which is used by the enemies in some cases of these societies. There may be different reasons, but I want to ask you, given that we speak about the EU and cross-border journalism, how likely is it that cross-border media, which is now gradually growing in the EU, over time reach out through their networks to countries outside of the EU too? And to what extent cross-border journalism could be a kind of EU brand or EU type of journalism that can eventually be exported, or maybe at least serve as inspiration for efforts at cross-border public space in other regions like Asia, Africa, South America.
Okay, I will start maybe with the countries that are not in the EU, but are that we are also, of course, following. I'm thinking of Georgia, for example. Many other countries. I mean, before talking about Asia and Africa and Latin America, I think this cross-border really does open is an open-minded way of either comparing the situations or maybe given an overview of a path that has been taken by some countries and that have been successful in preventing disinformation, for example. So we do publish, for example, at voxEurop, we regularly on the Georgian situation. So I do believe that if we have access to articles being published by, for example, independent journalists, be it in AU countries or non-AU countries, it gives a more independent view of what's going on. So it's not only an AU question. It's let's say it's a form of journalism that can be an inspiration and could open spaces for these journalists to maybe be published if they cannot be published in their own country. Could also be the case of independent media that had to flee Russia, for example, or decided to leave Russia after the invasion of Ukraine. Of course, at the moment, we're all dealing with potential fake news and Russian influence. That's all over Europe. It doesn't. It's not necessarily more in non-EU country than EU country. Maybe the EU is more equipped to maybe fight against it, but it's all over the place. What I mean by that we share common challenges across Europe in EU countries and non-EU countries. So I do believe that the more we collaborate, again, I'm just talking about journalism because that's what I know best. I suppose that politicians could do the same, but if you want to defend democracy and defend, of course, the role of journalism by giving the possibility to journalists to publish in different languages their work and their reportage and their analysis and their op-eds across Europe, I think it does help. So it's a model, I suppose, that could be I wouldn't want to say exported to other regions of the world because it doesn't have to be a neo-colonial way of looking at possibilities. I think every region has its own way, I suppose, of fighting for democracy and finding a way to support free and independent. Again, independence is the key. Independent journalism. So I wouldn't say we should export a cross-border public space, but of course, the more a public space is strong, wherever it is, the more information can circulate. And of course, I suppose the translation that we do promote is helps to have access to information that one wouldn't have access if you only speak one language. And of course, not everybody does read English. Many people do more and more in Europe, thanks to Erasmus, I suppose, and education. More and more people are enabled to read in English, but to read an article which is an in-depth article, or it's always easier, I suppose, to read it in your own language. So in a way, of course, in South America, you have Spanish and Portuguese. So the question of translation is probably not so acute. But the cross-border journalism, I think, is a very interesting and model and a promising one, I suppose, and it's good that it might be spreading.
Okay, let me finish with also your last phrase about the cross-border journalism phenomena. Do you think that it is that the media who are cross-border vary based on the political and social context in their countries, or is it instead one standard for cross-border journalism? Basically, is there only one way of doing cross-border journalism, or could there be multitudes with different reincarnations in different contexts of cross-border media?
Yeah, I think it's quite a difficult question you're asking me because um, I don't think there's one model, and certainly not one European model that should be applied, as just said before, to everybody, to every region. I think national context can be, or regional contexts are, of course, different across the globe. That's for sure, and there's not only one way of doing it. But I do believe that independence of thought, and independence of research and investigation is is probably something pretty universal. That if you cannot do your work, if you cannot investigate, if you risk to be put in jail, like we see in Russia every day, if you disagree with what the government is doing, or if you publish an opinion, this is the key, and this is maybe uh, yes, a universal way of looking at democracy. But I think medias are a key to not only promote democracy but preventing dictatorship or authoritarian regimes to step in on the freedom of expression and the freedom of journalism and information, generally speaking. So it can always be basically redefined. I don't think there's only one model, even though from what I'm doing today, I do think we learn also from each other's a lot. We are in touch with so many different media throughout Europe, and I wouldn't say that all Romanian media are the same, of course, or all Polish media are the same. They're all very different. So we tend, of course, to work together with the media that share the same kind of values and the same kind of uh, yes, same kind of targets and projects to try to contribute to a stronger European public sphere, or a stronger public sphere, generally speaking. That's one of our aims.